The story of India's freedom struggle did not begin with a single person. It began with a growing realization. India was being controlled not only politically, but economically. Indian industries suffered. Farmers faced heavy taxation. Indian resources were exported, while many Indians struggled with poverty. And slowly, a new generation began asking questions. Why should India be ruled by someone else? Why should Indians not decide their own future? In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded. Initially, its leaders demanded greater representation and political rights. But over time, the demand became much bigger. The demand became Swaraj, self-rule. In 1915, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returned to India. He brought with him an idea that would transform the freedom struggle. Not violence, not armies, but mass participation. Gandhi believed that ordinary people could challenge an empire through non-violent resistance. His early movements brought attention to the problems faced by farmers and workers. But the struggle soon became much larger. The non-cooperation movement encouraged Indians to withdraw their support from British institutions. People boycotted British goods. Students left institutions. Ordinary citizens entered the political movement. For perhaps the first time, the freedom struggle was becoming a movement of the masses. Then came the Salt March. In 1930, Gandhi walked from Sabarmati Ashram to Dandi, around 390 kilometers. The target was something incredibly ordinary. Salt, but the message was extraordinary. An empire that controlled even something as simple as salt could be challenged. The Salt March became one of the most powerful symbols of India's resistance. For many young Indians, waiting was not an option. They had grown up watching their country live under foreign rule. They had seen poverty, discrimination, violence, and humiliation become a part of everyday life. And slowly, a question began to grow in the minds of a new generation. How long could a nation wait for its freedom? For some, the answer was simple. Freedom demanded sacrifice. They believed that petitions and peaceful protests alone were not enough. They believed a young revolutionary who would go on to become one of the most powerful symbols of India's struggle for independence. Bhagat Singh. Born in 1907, Bhagat Singh grew up in a family deeply influenced by the freedom movement. The struggle for independence was not something distant to him. It was part of the world he had grown up seeing. As a young boy, he witnessed the impact of British rule and the growing anger among Indians. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 left a deep impression on him and on an entire generation. Thousands had gathered peacefully in Amritsar, and then, without warning, British troops opened fire. The tragedy shocked the country. For young Indians like Bhagat Singh, it became a symbol of the brutality of colonial rule. Chandrashekhar Azad, a revolutionary who refused to surrender. Prasad Bismil, a poet, thinker, and revolutionary who believed that freedom was worth the ultimate sacrifice. Ashfaqulla Khan, a man who stood beside his comrades, despite knowing the enormous risks involved. And many others whose names would eventually become part of India's history. Their method.
Their blood will not go in vain. Inqilab Zindabad!
On the 23rd of March 1931, they were executed. Bhagat Singh was only 23 years old. then there was another revolutionary force. Not a group of underground revolutionaries, not a handful of young men operating in secret, but an army. An army that believed India's freedom had to be fought for. The Indian National Army. And at its center stood a man whose name would become synonymous with courage, determination, and defiance. Subhas Chandra Bose, Netaji.
आजादी की लड़त में ये लड़त में प्राण दे दिया, उनके साथ जोड़ा जाएगा। ये नगर का नाम विट्ठल नगर से जाना जाए और हम आप लोगों की सबकी ये आशीषते हैं कि हमारा अधिवेशन संपूर्ण सफल हो।
His message was direct. Give me blood, and I will give you freedom. Thousands responded to that call. The Indian National Army brought together Indian soldiers and civilians who were determined to fight against British rule.
Has been present at Haripura in person to give us his blessings, loudspeakers. And I do hope that in future we shall make greater use of the film. In conclusion, I beg of you to remember that our mission remains unfulfilled. We have undoubtedly traveled a long way towards the goal of Swaraj, but complete independence has yet to be won. The coming months and years will prove to be a momentous period in our history, pregnant with immense possibilities. Let us therefore resolve to gird up our loins, sink all our differences, stand shoulder to shoulder, and continue our march towards the goal of Purna Swaraj.
For decades, the British Empire had depended heavily on Indian soldiers to maintain its power. But after the ENA, after the trials,
not obey these
after
orders.
years of war, could the British still be certain that Indian soldiers would always fight for the empire? That uncertainty was dangerous. The British Empire had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries. But by 1946, the question was no longer simply, will India become independent? The question was, how long can Britain continue to hold India? August 1942. India gave the British Empire perhaps its clearest message yet. Quit India. The demand was no longer gradual reform. It was no longer about asking for a greater Indian voice in government. It was no longer about waiting for promises of freedom somewhere in the future. The demand was immediate. India wanted independence, and it wanted it now.
India's national pride rose in revolt. Patriotic urge to action moved the people. It was a spontaneous mass upheaval. The temper of the people rose, and so did the temper of the alien government. 6 days after the internment.
This is a true Gandhi follower. Yes, Tom? This newsreel sure is a riot. And believe you me, Thomas, those bamboo sticks hurt. They can crack your skull. 150 were killed before this day was over.
Gandhi gave the movement its most powerful call. Do or die. Then came the Second World War, and the war changed the world. 1946, the situation had become even more difficult. After decades of struggle, after generations of sacrifice, after countless arrests, protests, imprisonments, and deaths, the end of British rule was finally approaching. But freedom would not arrive alone. It would come carrying a wound. Partition. The British Indian Empire was divided. India and Pakistan would emerge as separate nations, but the borders drawn on a map divided much more than territory. They divided communities, neighborhoods, villages, families, lives. Millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a border. They left their homes carrying whatever they could. Some walked, some traveled by train, some had nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Entire families were separated. Communities that had lived together for generations were torn apart. And across the subcontinent, violence spread. Countless lives were lost. Millions were displaced. The independence that generations had dreamed of had finally arrived, but it came at a terrible human cost. And then, at midnight, on the 15th of August 1947, India became independent.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
India inherited an enormous challenge. A poor country, a divided country, a country with hundreds of millions of people, a country emerging from nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. Its industries were limited, its infrastructure was weak. India had won its freedom, but now it had to prove that it could govern itself. And yet, India made a remarkable choice. Democracy. Not ruled by a king, not ruled by a military government, not ruled by a small group of elites, but government chosen by the people. On the 26th of January 1950, the Constitution of India came into effect. India became a republic, and its constitution established a democratic framework for a country of extraordinary diversity. One of the most remarkable features of this new democracy was universal adult suffrage. Every adult citizen, regardless of wealth, caste, gender, or social status, was given the right to vote. For a newly independent country where literacy was still low and poverty was widespread, this was an extraordinary decision. India was essentially saying, you do not have to be rich to have a voice. You do not have to be educated to have a vote. You do not have to belong to a powerful family to participate in the future of your country. Your vote is your voice. And then, India began the enormous task of building itself. Universities, factories, dams, research laboratories, scientific institutions, roads, power plants, industries, one institution after another, India began creating the foundations of a modern nation. The goal was not simply economic growth, it was self-reliance. India wanted the ability to educate its own people, to produce its own engineers and scientists, to generate its own electricity, to build its own industries, and eventually, to develop technologies of its own. But there was one problem that could not wait. Food. At independence, India faced serious food shortages. Agricultural productivity was low, population was growing, and the country depended heavily on food imports. Then came a transformation, the Green Revolution. New agricultural technologies began changing Indian farming. Improved crop varieties, better irrigation, chemical fertilizers, modern farming practices, and greater use of agricultural research. Farmers, scientists, and institutions worked together to dramatically increase agricultural production. The results were transformative. India's food production rose, agricultural productivity improved, and the country gradually moved towards food self-sufficiency. The India that had once feared famine was learning to feed itself. It was not an overnight transformation. There were failures, there were shortages, there were difficult years. But slowly, a country that had begun independence struggling simply to survive was beginning to build the foundations of something much larger. A nation that could educate, a nation that could manufacture, a nation that could research, a nation that could feed itself, and above all, a nation that had chosen to decide its future through the ballot box. And then, India began looking beyond its borders. Not because it had forgotten its problems, but because it had begun to believe that its possibilities were much larger than them. In 1969, India established the asterisk Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO. At the beginning, India's space program had very little money, very limited infrastructure. But ambition was never limited. India began developing its own satellites, its own launch vehicles, its own space technologies. There were moments when India's rockets did not even leave the launch pad as planned. But every failure became another lesson, and every lesson took India a little further. Then came missions that once seemed almost impossible. India began exploring the moon, and then Mars. In 2014, India's Mars Orbiter mission successfully entered orbit around Mars. India became the first Asian nation to reach Mars orbit, and the first country in the world to do so on its first attempt. The mission was also accomplished at a remarkably low cost. In 2023 came another historic achievement. Chandrayaan-3. After earlier challenges, India returned to the moon, and this time, the landing succeeded. Today, a smartphone can place a bank in your pocket. It can provide access to education, communication, shopping, government services, and financial transactions. India's digital payment ecosystem has grown to an extraordinary scale, with millions of transactions taking place digitally every day. Technology did not simply change India's economy, it began changing everyday life. Indian cinema travels across borders. Indian music reaches audiences far beyond South Asia. The people who fought for India's freedom could not see the India we see today. They could not see our cities, our technology, our scientists, our athletes, our entrepreneurs, our flag flying across the world. They could only dream of it. A free India, a stronger India, an India that could decide its own destiny. And that dream came at a price. Millions struggled, thousands went to prison, many never came home, and countless ordinary people sacrificed pieces of their lives so that a future generation could live in freedom. We are that generation. Our responsibility is not simply to remember their sacrifice, it is to understand what it meant. To understand that freedom was not the end of the journey, it was the beginning of a responsibility. The responsibility to build, to question, to create, to protect what was achieved, and to imagine what comes next. So now, the question is no longer, what did they do for India? The question is, what will we do with the India they gave us?
This documentary is a collaborative attempt by Sounabha Mandal and Mrinmoy to present the story of India's freedom struggle through two distinct filmmaking approaches.
While Sounabha explores historical reenactment and visualization, bringing moments from India's past into a more tangible and contemporary visual form, Mrinmoy approaches the subject through creative storytelling and cinematic expression. The result is an effort to bridge history and imagination, combining factual events with a narrative style intended to make the journey more engaging and accessible.
As with any student-led creative production, certain historical, technical, or cinematic inaccuracies may occur during the process. We sincerely acknowledge and apologize for any such shortcomings. We request our viewers to watch the documentary with an open mind and attentive eye, and to experience not merely the events of history, but the story, emotions, and perspective through which we have attempted to portray them.